chunks. By January of 1887, the Wyoming Valley had become a white, frozen silence.
Inside the house, Astrid Hale rationed every stick of firewood while cold seeped through the walls. But each morning, she moved the third row of split wood. Beneath it was a hidden hatch.
Months earlier, Astrid had secretly dug 9 feet into the earth there, lining the chamber with fieldstone, hay, waxed canvas.
Now, during the coldest week the valley had seen, she pulled the leather strap and lifted the hatch.
Her father never called it a trick, he called it thinking ahead of the cold. She was 8 years old the first time he took her underground, on the family homestead in Dolly's Hollow, Tucker County, West Virginia, where the Appalachian ridgelines folded over each other like the spines of old books left open in the rain. It was late October. The surface ground had already begun to stiffen under the first serious frosts of the season. Leaves from the black walnut trees along the creek had dropped in a single week, carpeting the hillside in a brittle amber that crackled underfoot like something being read aloud by fire. But below the foundation of the old smokehouse, 8 feet beneath the fieldstone footings her grandfather had laid, before the war the air held at what her father told her was just above 40 degrees. She did not understand what that meant in any practical sense, not yet. But she felt the warmth rising to meet her face as she climbed down the stone steps behind him, her small hand gripping the iron ring set into the wall, her knees scraping the damp limestone edge of the second step where the mortar had long since crumbled away. The smell reached her before the temperature did. Earth, mineral, the particular sweetness of packed clay that has not seen sunlight in decades. Below it something sharper, the vinegar tang of sealed crocks, the faint animal smell of rendered fat under wax lids, the slow exhalation of potatoes stored in burlap against stone. Her father crouched beside a row of wax-sealed crocks, his breath barely visible in the lamplight. Calvin Hale was not a man who lectured. He was a stonemason by trade, a farmer by necessity, a teacher only when the lesson could be delivered with his hands rather than his voice. He pressed his palm flat against the wall, fingers spread wide, reading something in the rock that she could not yet read. The earth remembers summer longer than we do. His voice was quiet, the way it always got when he was telling her something he considered important. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that, you stop fighting winter. You start borrowing what the ground already has. She filed it away the way children file things, without categories, without labels, in a drawer that has no name. A lesson without a test. A fact that sat in the back of her mind for 27 years, collecting dust in a corner she rarely visited. Through the rest of her childhood in Dolly's Hollow. Through her mother's death when Astrid was 14, a fever that burned through in 6 days while Calvin sat beside the bed, pressing wet cloth to a forehead that grew hotter each morning until it stopped being hot at all. Through the years of helping her father maintain the homestead alone, learning to split wood along the grain without wasting the stroke, to read weather from the posture of cattle, to seal a crock so the brine held through March. Through meeting Emmett Hale at a church supper in Parsons when she was 23, a man from Randolph County who shared her surname by coincidence, not blood, a fact that amused them both enough to remember it later. Through the wedding in the spring of 1874. Through the 5 years of trying to make a living on rented bottom land along the Cheat River, where the soil was good but the rent took everything the soil produced. The lesson sat through all of it, untouched, gathering weight in the dark the way fieldstone gathers heat, slowly, invisibly, without anyone noticing until the moment it matters. That moment arrived in the winter of 1886 in a river valley in northern Wyoming territory, when the temperature outside Astrid's property dropped to 44 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, held there for 9 consecutive days, killed livestock across 3 counties, froze the earth to a depth that split fence posts like kindling, silenced the creek she had relied on for water since the day she arrived, took everything it could reach above the surface while 8,500 pounds of fieldstone 9 feet below a firewood shed held the line at 39 degrees, asking nothing in return. Her name was Astrid Hale. She had come to Wyoming territory from West Virginia with her husband Emmett in the spring of 1879, following a letter from a land agent in Buffalo who had written with cautious optimism about acreage prices along the eastern slope of the Bighorn Range. The letter mentioned grass tall enough to brush a horse's belly, water that ran year-round, timber on the north-facing slopes that would take a generation to cut through. The letter did not mention the winters. Or if it did, Astrid had not properly understood what the word meant at that latitude, at that altitude, in a territory where the wind came down from Canada across 1,000 miles of open plain with nothing to slow it but barbed wire that had not yet been strung. The 100 acres they purchased along a tributary of Clear Creek in Johnson County was honest ground, grass in the low meadows thick enough to justify the land agent's letter. A creek that ran cold through limestone channels most of the year, ponderosa pine on the north slope dense enough to darken the ground at midday. The soil was heavier than what they had known in West Virginia morite, less loam, but it broke clean under the plow when the frost left it in April, which was 3 weeks later than Astrid expected every single year she lived there. They built the house first, a single-story frame structure with a stone chimney that Emmett laid himself using skills he did not have but acquired through the particular education of necessity, which is the only kind that sticks. The chimney drew well enough. The roof held through 2 seasons before it needed re-shingling. The floor was punch-and-split logs laid flat side up, adzide smooth enough to walk on barefoot in summer but never truly level, so that a marble placed on the kitchen floor would roll slowly toward the northeast corner, a fact Astrid discovered during their second winter, watching it migrate across the planks while the wind pressed against the north wall like something trying to get in. They built the barn second, board and batten construction, for 2 horses, a milk, whatever chicken survived the foxes. Emmett built the Firewood shed in their second year, a simple open-face structure, 18 feet wide, feet deep, roofed with cedar shakes, open on the south side where wood was loaded in autumn, pulled through winter. He tucked it against a low ridge at the northeast corner of the property, its back wall sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind that came off the Bighorn foothills in sustained gusts that could strip heat from a building the way a river strips bark from a downed log. 5 years of building. 5 years of breaking ground, hauling stones, splitting fence rails, losing chickens to weather they had not yet learned to predict. Not prosperous years, but sufficient ones, by the standard of sufficiency that homesteaders in the 1880s understood, which was a standard so narrow it would make a modern person weep. No new debt. Firewood stacked to the rafters before the first snow. Livestock through the winter with all 4 legs under them in March. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house that held their stores through an ordinary cold season without catastrophic loss. That cellar was the problem Astrid recognized almost immediately, but could not solve while Emmett was alive, because solving it would have meant admitting that the thing he had built was inadequate, which was a conversation she chose not to have during the years when there were enough other conversations to fill the days. The cellar was 14 feet long, 8 wide, walls lined with stacked fieldstone, roofed with rough-cut lumber under 2 feet of banked earth. In a mild winter it held between 38 to 42 degrees, cold enough to prevent spoilage, warm enough to prevent freezing, occupying the narrow band of temperature that separates preservation from waste. In the winter of 1884, a 3-week cold snap unlike anything they had experienced in 5 years on the property drove the temperature inside that cellar down to 22 degrees. Everything Astrid had not moved closer to the house froze solid. 100 pounds of potatoes, 3 crocks of pickled cabbage, most of her dried apple stores. The loss was not fatal in a year when there were 2 of them, 2 incomes of labor, 2 sets of hands to compensate through the spring by working harder, planting earlier, preserving more. She could not afford it again, not now. October of 1885 was the month the world changed shape beneath Astrid's feet, though she did not recognize the full geometry of the change until weeks later, when the shock had settled into something more permanent, not grief exactly, but a rearrangement of every assumption she had built her daily life upon. Emmett went up the north slope on the 14th of October with 2 neighbors, Gideon Marsh's youngest hired hand, a boy of 19, along with one of the Dawes brothers from the property south of theirs. They were cutting ponderosa pine for winter fuel, the annual ritual that every household in the valley performed between the first frost, when the sap slowed, making the wood easier to split, to the first heavy snow which made the slope impassable. They had felled 2 trees without incident. The third one, a tall straight pine with a trunk diameter that Emmett estimated at 20 inches, hung up on a neighboring tree as it fell. The angle of the cut had been slightly wrong, or the wind shifted at the moment of commitment, or the neighboring tree's branches caught the falling trunk in a way that redirected its momentum from the planned line of fall to something unpredictable. Emmett had tied a guide rope around the trunk before the cut, which was standard practice among men who had learned to fell timber by doing it rather than by reading about it. The rope held. Emmett's footing did not. When the hung tree broke free under its own weight, the butt end kicked sideways across the slope. Emmett was 4 feet to the left of where he should have been. The trunk caught him across the lower back with the full momentum of 800 pounds of green pine traveling at the speed of gravity. They carried him home on a plank. The boy held one end. The Dawes brother held the other. Astrid heard the horse before she heard the voices cob, their brown gelding, coming up the lane at a pace that was not right, too fast for a working return, too deliberate for a runaway. She was at the door before they reached the yard. Emmett did not die immediately. He lay in the bed for 4 days, while something inside him that had been displaced by the impact continued to displace further, pressing on things that could not tolerate pressure. There was no doctor within a day's ride. The nearest surgeon was in Buffalo, 23 miles east, reachable in good weather by a hard ride of 5 hours. The weather was not good. A storm system had settled over the Bighorn foothills, dropping rain that turned to ice on every surface it touched, making the roads impassable for anything except a man on foot willing to risk a broken leg with every step. By the time the weather broke on the 3rd day, Emmett's breathing had changed in a way that Astrid recognized from her mother's death 11 years earlier, the particular sound of a body that has stopped trying to recover its losses. He died on the morning of the 18th. The rain had stopped overnight. The sky was the pale, empty blue that follows a storm in Wyoming, so clean it looked like something had been removed from it. Emmett was 37 years old. Astrid was 34. She had no family within 500 miles. Calvin Hale had died in 1881, a fall from a barn roof in Dolly's Hollow, the kind of death that took men in the mountains of West Virginia with the same indifferent regularity that falling timber took them in Wyoming. The homestead in Tucker County had been sold to cover his debts. There was nothing to go back to, even if Astrid had managed the money for the journey, which she had not. She had the 100 acres. She had Cobb, the brown gelding, 11 years old, sound in all 4 legs but beginning to show his age in the mornings when the cold stiffened his joints before the day's work warmed them loose. She had Flint, a mixed-breed dairy cow with a disposition that alternated between patient tolerance of human proximity in warm weather to a kind of sullen withdrawal in cold. As though winter were a personal insult she chose to endure in silence rather than protest. She had a woodshed stocked with roughly 2 cords of split pine, enough for 6 weeks of moderate cold, not enough for what was coming, though she did not know yet what was coming. She had a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house that she had recognized for 3 years as dangerously inadequate for any winter worse than ordinary. What she did not have was time to mourn in the way that mourning requires, which is to say slowly, without interruption, with the luxury of sitting still long enough for the weight of absence to settle into its permanent shape. The homestead did not pause for grief. The horse needed feeding, the cow needed milking, the chickens needed whatever chickens need, which is everything, constantly, with no gratitude. The north wall of the house had a gap along the second log course where the chinking had crumbled during the summer rains, letting cold air seep through in a draft that found the back of Astrid's neck every time she stood at the kitchen counter. The firewood supply was short by at least 1.5 cords for a normal winter, possibly 2 cords short for a hard one. The root cellar needed attention she could not give it before the ground froze. She worked through October the way people work, when the alternative to working is thinking about the thing they cannot afford to think about yet: splitting wood, hauling water, re-chinking the north wall with a mixture of clay, straw, chopped grass that she mixed in a bucket by the back door each morning until her hands cracked from the alkaline bite of the clay, oiling every piece of leather tack in the barn so it would not stiffen through the cold months, checking the cellar temperature each morning with a thermometer. Emmett had bought at the general store in Buffalo during their first year a simple mercury instrument nailed to the center post, its accuracy uncertain but its trends reliable. November passed, December pressed in. The routine of survival absorbed the hours that grief would otherwise have filled, which was not healing, it was postponement, a debt of feeling that would come due later, at a time she could not predict, in a currency she could not prepare for. Through the winter of 1885 into 1886, Astrid managed. The cold was ordinary. The cellar held, the stores lasted. Flint came through with her weight down but her health intact. Cobb ate steadily, drank steadily, pulled the sled to the woodlot when Astrid needed to haul timber for the last cuts of the season. Spring arrived in April, late, reluctant but real. The creek ran, the grass came up. Astrid planted potatoes, turnips, a row of cabbages along the south side of the house, where the reflected heat from the wall gave them 2 extra weeks of growing season compared to the open field. She put up 11 quarts of pickled beets. She rendered lard from a hog she bought from the Dawes brothers at a price that was fair because they were decent men, which is the only economy that functions reliably in a place where your nearest neighbor is also your nearest help. By August of 1886, the homestead was producing again, not abundantly but steadily, in the particular way that a single person operating without margin can produce when every calorie of effort is directed at a defined purpose with no energy wasted on ambition beyond the boundary of the next season. Astrid had paid nothing on the debts Emmett left behind. There was no one pressing for payment, not yet. The matter sat in the background like weather on the horizon, visible but not immediate. What was immediate, what began to press on Astrid's attention in the first week of September 1886, with a weight she recognized from somewhere deep in her body, rather than from any specific piece of information, was the quality of the season's turning. September arrived early that year, not on the calendar, on the ground. The grass in the low meadows began to yellow a full 2 weeks ahead of the previous year. The creek dropped to levels Astrid had not seen before mid-October. The wild geese that passed through the valley each autumn, following the drainage south toward the Platte, came through 3 weeks earlier than she had ever recorded, flying in formations so tight they looked less like migration than evacuation. At the trading post in Gillette, a half-day's ride northwest, the nearest place where information traveled faster than horseback, the old-timers were talking. Astrid went for salt, for lamp oil, for a bag of coffee beans that she rationed at 1 cup per day through the cold months. She heard the conversations without participating in them, the way women in that territory often received information standing near enough to listen, far enough to avoid being addressed, occupying the particular social position of a widow who had not remarried, which in 1886 Wyoming was a position that generated more speculation than sympathy. The fat on the game animals was wrong. That was the first thing she heard from a hunter whose name she did not catch, speaking to the store owner with the quiet authority of a man reporting a fact he wished were not true. Elk taken at 8,000 feet in the Bighorns were carrying a layer of back fat nearly twice what was normal for early September. The animals knew something. Their bodies were preparing for a severity that the calendar had not yet announced. Gideon Marsh, 60 years old, one of the first permanent settlers in the valley, a man whose opinions carried weight because they were delivered rarely, without decoration, at volumes barely above a whisper, stood at the counter buying wire for fence repair. His voice carried across the store the way stones carry across water, skipping once before sinking in. This winter will not be ordinary. He did not elaborate. He paid for his wire. He left. Astrid rode home with the salt, the oil, the coffee. She put them away in the kitchen. She stood at the window looking north toward the Bighorn foothills, where the first dusting of snow had appeared on the peaks a full month ahead of schedule, white against the afternoon sky like a warning written in a language she was only now beginning to translate. The old cellar was not going to hold. She had known this since the freeze of 1884, known it the way you know a thing you have chosen not to act on, because acting requires admitting a failure that belongs to someone you loved, which is a more difficult admission than admitting your own. The cellar was too shallow, too exposed to surface temperature swings, oriented wrong, facing northwest, directly into the prevailing wind that came off the foothills with nothing between it and Canada but grass. The walls were adequate stone, but the roof was insufficient rough lumber. Under 2 feet of earth was not enough mass to resist the kind of cold that Marsh's voice, the hunter's fat report, the early geese all pointed toward. She needed something deeper, something sheltered, something built on the principle that Calvin Hale had pressed into her memory 30 years ago, with his palm flat against a limestone wall in Dolly's Hollow, his breath barely visible, his voice quiet with the particular weight of a man telling his daughter the one thing he most wanted her to remember. The firewood shed. She saw it the way her father would have seen it, not as a structure but as a system of thermal relationships. The ridge behind it broke the northwest wind. The cedar shake roof sheltered the ground beneath from rain, snow, direct solar heating in summer, all the forces that cause surface temperature to swing wildly between seasons. The floor had never been turned. Decades of undisturbed subsoil, compacted by its own weight, insulated from above by the shed floor, by the stacked wood, by the ridge. Soil that had been maintaining its own temperature, slowly, invisibly, without anyone asking it to, since before Emmett drove the first post for the structure. The location carried one additional advantage that Astrid valued more than she could easily articulate. It was the last place anyone would look for a storage cellar. The shed was a firewood shed. It looked like a firewood shed. It did nothing that a firewood shed does not do. Under the rows of split pine, beneath the ordinary floor, behind the ordinary purpose of the ordinary structure, there would be 9 feet of earth, stone, hay, canvas between the surface of the world, above where winter killed what it could reach, from the still, slow warmth below, where summer lingered in the rock like a memory that refused to fade. That too was part of the design. She began on the 8th of September, when the surface ground was still workable, but the air already carried the particular edge of coming cold, a sharpness in the nostrils at dawn, a thinness in the light by 4 in the afternoon, the smell of frost forming on grass that was still technically green. She marked out a rectangle 9 feet by 14 in the back half of the shed, beneath the rows of stacked pine that she first had to move, piece by piece, to the yard. She started with a long-handled spade. The first foot came up easy. Black topsoil, light with root matter, loose from years of organic accumulation beneath the shed floor. It smelled of rain, of decomposition, the slow, patient work that soil does when left alone. She loaded it into the wheelbarrow, the same one Emmett had used to haul stone for the chimney, pushed it 30 yards to a low spot at the edge of the hayfield where the ground dipped enough to accept fill without looking unnatural. Dumped it. Walked back. Loaded again. The second foot was heavier. Dense clay-laced subsoil, the color of old brick, that came up in dark clods requiring the spade's full edge to separate from the mass below. It smelled of iron, the particular mineral smell of deep earth that has not seen light in decades, a smell that Astrid recognized instantly from Dolly's Hollow, from the cellar her father had dug, from the walls of cut earth that Calvin Hale had lined with stone, pulled from the creek below their property using nothing but a sledge, a pry bar, the back of a mule named Soot, who had died the year before Astrid was born, but whose name survived in family conversation as a unit of measurement, strong as Soot, stubborn as Soot, the way useful things survive in language, long after the thing itself is gone. By the third foot she had switched to the mattock, hardpan compressed earth with a calcium content that made it ring under the pick like something between clay, rock, a material that did not want to be disturbed. She broke it in short measured swings, loading the spoil into the wheelbarrow, walking the 30 yards, dumping, walking 3 hours in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 13 days of pale September light. Her shoulders stopped aching on the 5th day, not because the work got easier, because her body stopped registering the complaint as useful information. The muscles adapted, the rhythm became automatic. Load, push, dump, return. The mathematics of physical labor at its most elemental, energy in, earth out, depth gained in increments measured not in feet but in the diminishing distance between where she stood each morning at dawn, the line of sky visible above the pit's rim. By day 9 she was standing in a hole deep enough that the sky was a rectangle of blue directly overhead, framed by earth walls the color of rust. The temperature at the bottom was noticeably different from the surface, cooler in the afternoon heat, warmer in the early morning chill. The crossover point, the depth at which the Earth's own thermal mass begins to dominate, where surface weather becomes irrelevant, where the temperature stabilizes into a narrow band that does not care what the sky is doing. 9 feet she stopped digging. The walls she lined with flat fieldstone collected from the bed of Clear Creek. Over 3 trips during the summer months, 160 pounds of creek wash stone, hauled in the wagon behind Cobb, stacked near the shed through July, while the reason for the stacking remained unexplained to anyone who might have noticed, which was no one, because the particular advantage of being a widow on a remote homestead is that no one watches you closely enough to ask questions about rocks. She set the stones dry without mortar, fitting them tight against the earth walls the way her father had taught her, not by instruction but by proximity, by the years of watching Calvin Hale work stone the way other men worked wood, with a patience that treated each piece as a problem of geometry rather than force. Flat face out. Irregular edges packed with coarse sand tamped into the gaps using a section of broom handle. Stone against earth. Earth surrounding stone. The principle was identical to what she had felt with her palm against the wall at 8 years old. Stone absorbs heat slowly, releases it slowly. A stone wall underground does not cool at the same rate as the air above it. It resists, it holds. It gives back what it stored through summer long after the surface has gone white. The floor received equal care. Packed earth leveled flat with the back of the spade, covered first with 3 inches of coarse wash sand hauled from a gravel bar upstream on Clear Creek. Over the sand she laid a second course of stones, smaller flat pieces, each one heated in a sustained bonfire she built at the field edge, then carried to the pit wrapped in burlap while still warm. The logic was simple, almost primitive, built from the same understanding that drives every thermal storage system from a hearthstone to a masonry oven: mass holds temperature. A floor laid with stones that have been fire heated before burial will not surrender that warmth in a single night. The thermal mass of 200 pounds of fieldstone sitting at ground level 9 feet below the surface, insulated from above by earth, canvas, hay, wood, will carry a trace of that stored heat for weeks after the surface world has frozen solid. The roof was the part that required the most thought, because the roof is where every underground structure either succeeds or fails. A cellar can have perfect walls, a perfect floor, 9 feet of perfect depth, but if the roof allows cold to penetrate from above, the entire system collapses into the same inadequacy as a shallow cellar with no walls at all. Heat does not leak sideways through 9 feet of earth. It leaks downward, through the ceiling, through whatever barrier separates the controlled environment below from the uncontrolled one above. She used 6-inch rough-sawn pine planks laid across the 9-foot span in 2 sections, supported at the center by a beam mortised into notches cut into the stone walls on opposite sides. Over the planks she packed 4 inches of the driest hay from last summer's cutting, compressed by hand, layered like thatch, dense enough to hold its shape under the weight of what would go above it, airy enough to trap the dead air pockets that make hay one of the most effective natural insulators available to any farming household that keeps livestock. Dead air does not conduct. Dead air resists. A 4-inch layer of compressed hay contains millions of tiny pockets of motionless atmosphere, each one a barrier, each one a refusal, each one saying to the cold above it, not through here, not tonight. Over the hay she stretched a sheet of waxed canvas salvaged from a grain cover that had torn along one edge during the previous autumns, threshing, the kind of material that accumulates on a working farm, too damaged for its original purpose, too useful to discard, waiting in a corner of the barn for the day when its second life begins. She overlapped the edges a full foot on each side, tucking them down against the wall stones, pressing the waxed surface tight against the hay to create a moisture barrier. Water was the enemy of hay insulation. Wet hay compresses. Compressed hay loses its air pockets. Lost air pockets mean lost insulation. The canvas kept the rain out, the snowmelt out, the condensation from the earth above out, preserving the hay's structure, which preserved the hay's function, which preserved the temperature below. Over the canvas she shoveled 12 inches of subsoil from the spoil pile at the field edge, pressing it into a low arch with her hands, her knees, the flats of her boots, smoothing the surface until it looked like undisturbed ground, the kind of ground you would walk across without a second thought, the kind of ground that tells you nothing about what lies beneath it. Then she stacked the firewood back over it, every split piece returned to exactly where it had been, the rows neat, ordinary, unremarkable. The hatch concealed beneath the third row from the right, a 2-foot square of pine planks that lifted on a leather pole strap, invisible unless you moved the wood, knew what you were looking for. To anyone loading or pulling firewood from that shed, nothing had changed. The floor looked solid. The wood sat in its ordinary rows. The structure was the same building it had always been, in the same corner of the same property, doing the same thing it had always done. Gideon Marsh stopped his wagon at her lane one afternoon in late August, before the digging had begun but after the stone hauling was already visible. He did this occasionally pausing at the property line the way men in remote country pause at each other's boundaries, not to visit exactly, but to exchange the minimum quantity of human contact that prevents isolation from becoming something clinical. He could see the mound of displaced subsoil at the edge of the hayfield. He could see the stacked creek stone near the shed. He looked at it the way you look at something that does not fit the pattern you expect, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention of a man who has survived 60 years by noticing when patterns break. Building something? His voice carried the careful neutrality of a question that is also an observation. Improving the storage. Astrid's voice carried nothing at all. Flat. Informational. The voice of a woman who has learned that the less you explain, the less you are required to defend. Under the woodshed? Not quite a question. The slight rise at the end was more like a bookmark, a place he was marking in a conversation he intended to return to later. Yes, he turned his hat in his hands. The gesture was his something he did when buying himself time, deciding whether to say a thing or leave it where it lay. The hat was a wide-brimmed felt, sweat-stained dark along the band, the kind of hat that becomes part of a man's face after enough years of wearing it. He turned it once, twice, placed it back on his head. He clicked his horse forward without another word, drove on down the road toward his own property 4 miles east. 3 weeks later, through the ordinary channels of rural information, transferred the trading post in Gillette primarily, the feed mill secondarily, the spaces where men gathered without women present, where opinions circulated like currency with no fixed denomination. Astrid heard that the phrase "that Hale woman with her hole" had made at least one public appearance. She found she did not mind particularly. She had always cared more about what worked than about what people called it. In the last days of September, she lowered everything into the pit by lamplight, working carefully alone in the cool, dry air of the completed cellar that smelled of stone, sand, canvas, earth, the smell of preparation, the smell of a thing being exactly what it was built to be. 140 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, each sack tied with hemp cord at the neck to keep moisture out while allowing the tubers to breathe. 60 pounds of turnips, their greens trimmed to a half-inch stub that would dry without rotting. 4 crocks of salted pork sealed with rendered fat, the fat poured molten over the packed meat in August, hardened now into a white cap that would not crack unless the temperature dropped below the low 20s, which in this cellar at this depth it would not. 11-quart jars of pickled beets along with cabbage sealed with wax, the glass thick enough to tolerate the slow temperature shifts underground, but not thick enough to survive a freeze, which was exactly why the old cellar's 22-degree failure in 1884 had cracked 3 jars, spilling brine across the floor, wasting weeks of summer labor and a single night of cold that the shallow walls could not resist. 2 crocks of lard. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal inside a cedar box she had fitted with a tight-sealed lid, the cedar's natural oils discouraging moisture, insects, the particular mold that grows on grain stored in damp enclosures. A tin box containing $35 in paper money, wrapped twice in oilcloth, every dollar of cash she possessed in the world, placed underground because underground was the one place on the property that would not burn if the house caught fire, would not blow away if the roof failed in a windstorm, would not be found by anyone who came onto the property with intention she could not predict. Everything she would need to survive a hard winter, without leaving the property, without spending a dollar she did not have, without asking for help she could not repay. The mathematics of self-sufficiency at its most compressed, calories stored below ground, fuel stacked above it, a woman's labor bridging the distance between the two, measured not in feet but in the depth of the knowledge that told her where to dig, how deep to go, what to line the walls with, how to seal the roof. She climbed up out of the pit, replaced the hatch, stacked the firewood back into its rows, 3rd row from the right, the leather strap tucked beneath the lowest piece invisible. She stood in the shed looking at the ordinary floor, the ordinary wood, the ordinary structure that concealed beneath its ordinary surface, 9 feet of earth, stone, hay, canvas between the coming winter, above the stored warmth of a dead summer below. She went back that night, past midnight. The sky was clear, September stars over Wyoming. The Milky Way so dense it looked less like individual points of light than like a river of light flowing across the darkness, the way Clear Creek flowed across the valley floor in daylight, following the low ground because light, like water, goes where resistance is least. She opened the hatch, climbed down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall, each one reinforced with a flat stone set into the tread, each one worn already by the 13 days of climbing in with tools, climbing out with spoil, climbing in with stone, climbing out for more. The lamplight fell on the crocks, the jars, the cedar box, the burlap sacks resting against the stone wall in a row that looked in the yellow light, in the underground silence, in the smell of earth, mineral, wax exactly like the row of crocks in her father's cellar in Dolly's Hollow. The same arrangement, the same materials, the same principle made physical, made real, made present in a place 1,500 miles from where she had first encountered it at the age of 8. With her hand on an iron ring, her knees scraping limestone, she turned down the lamp. Sat on the bottom step in complete darkness. The air was cool, not cold. 40 degrees she estimated, maybe 41, the same temperature her father had told her about in Dolly's Hollow, the same range, the same steady patient warmth that the earth produces when left alone at sufficient depth, sheltered from the chaos above. No wind, no sound except the faint settling of stone against earth, the occasional tick of a cooling jar adjusting to the ambient temperature, the slow breathing of a woman sitting in a cellar she had built with her own hands in a territory where no one had asked her to build it, no one had helped her build it, no one would know it existed unless she chose to show them. This was the first moment since Emmett's death, 11 months, 6 days, that Astrid did not feel afraid of the winter that was coming. Not because the winter would be less severe. Everything she had heard, the early geese, the fat on the elk, Marsh's quiet warning at the trading post, pointed towards something worse than anything she had experienced in 7 years on the property. The fear had not diminished because the threat had diminished. The fear had diminished because she had done something about it. The cellar existed. The stores were inside it. The temperature held. The stones she had hauled from Clear Creek in July were doing what stones do when placed underground at depth, remembering the warmth they had absorbed through summer, releasing it so slowly that winter could not steal it faster than it was given. Every good thing she knew about the earth she had learned from a man who taught with his hands rather than his voice, in a cellar dug into a hillside in West Virginia 30 years before this night. Calvin Hale had not told her she would need this. He had not predicted Wyoming, the homestead, Emmett's death, the winters that tested everything above ground with a ruthlessness that did not negotiate. He had only pressed his palm against a stone wall, spread his fingers, closed his eyes for a moment in the lamplight, then spoken a single sentence that his daughter carried inside her like a seed carried inside a coat pocket, forgotten until the season is right, then planted, then grown into the thing it was always going to become. She sat in the dark for 10 minutes, maybe longer. The cool air held her the way still water holds a stone completely, without pressure, without demand. Then she climbed the 8 steps, replaced the hatch, stacked the wood, walked to the house under the September stars, let herself in through the kitchen door, heated water on the range for tea she did not drink, sat at the table with her hands around the cup, until the warmth faded from the ceramic into the cool air of the house, which was always colder than the cellar, which would always be colder than the cellar, because the house fought winter at the surface, where winter was strongest. The cellar did not fight, it borrowed, it waited, it held. October hardened. The birch along Clear Creek dropped their leaves in a single week, a rush of gold that covered the creek bank like a currency being devalued overnight, worth everything on Monday, worth nothing by Friday. The fields went from amber to gray to white in less than 2 weeks. The creek froze over in the second week of November, which was early even by the standards of men who had lived in the valley since the territory was organized. Astrid spent the darkening afternoons of late autumn doing the work that separated the households that survived winter comfortably from the ones that endured it by the width of whatever margin remained between what they had prepared, what the season demanded. Rechinking the north wall where cold air still found its way through despite the October repairs, pressing the clay mixture into gaps she could feel with her fingertips before she could see them, working by touch in the diminishing light of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, the sun dropping behind the Bighorn foothills earlier each day, stealing 15 minutes of working light with each rotation of the calendar, oiling every piece of leather tack in the barn bridle, traces, the collar Cobb wore when pulling the sled, the spare set of reins Emmett had braided from rawhide during their 3rd winter, working by the parlor stove while Astrid read aloud from a newspaper that was already 6 weeks old by the time it reached them, splitting the last of her summer-cut wood, building the pile under the shed to a full 4 cords, enough, she calculated, for 12 weeks of hard cold if she rationed carefully, enough if the winter was severe but not unprecedented. She did not yet know that the winter of 1886 would be unprecedented, that it would enter the language of the territory as a proper noun, the big die-up spoken for decades afterward with the particular reverence that people reserve for catastrophes they survive by margins so thin the survival itself feels borrowed, temporary, revocable at any moment by the same indifferent force that created the catastrophe in the first place. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the cellar held at 41 degrees on the first morning of November, while the surface temperature read 18 above zero on the porch thermometer. She only knew that the potatoes were dry, the lard was firm, the jars were intact, the $35 in oilcloth was where she had placed it. She only knew that the ground remembered summer longer than she did, that it would take months to cool, that she had stopped fighting the cold, that she had begun, in the most literal sense available to a woman, standing alone on a frozen hillside in Wyoming territory in 1886, to borrow what the ground already had. The lesson had waited 27 years for its test. The test was coming. The first real test came in early December. Not the worst that was still weeks away, gathering itself above the Canadian border like a debt compounding interest, but cold enough to tell her something she needed to know before the telling became a matter of survival rather than confirmation. On the morning of December 9th, the thermometer nailed to the north porch post read 14 degrees below zero. The nail holding the instrument had worked itself loose during a November windstorm, so the thermometer hung at a slight angle, the mercury column tilted just enough that reading it required Astrid to crouch, tilt her head, sight along the glass tube the way you sight along a rifle barrel, one eye closed, the other tracking the thin silver thread to the number it met. 14 below. She had seen colder in her 7 years on the property, but never this early in December. The season was running ahead of itself, burning through its reserves of moderate cold the way a spendthrift burns through an inheritance, arriving at severity weeks before severity was expected. She waited until midday, when the sun had done whatever modest work it could manage at that latitude in December, lifting the air temperature to perhaps 5 below, though she did not check, because the difference between 14 below at dawn, 5 below at noon was the difference between a blow to the jaw versus a blow to the shoulder. Both hurt, one simply hurts less. She walked to the woodshed, moved aside the birch from the 3rd row, lifted the hatch by the leather strap, which was stiff from the cold but still functional, the rawhide darkened by moisture that had wickeded into the grain despite the waxing she had applied in October. The air that rose from below was something she had been waiting to feel for 3 months, without admitting to herself that she was waiting. Cool, faintly moist the way air is moist in a spring house or along a creek bank in September. Not cold, not the biting assault of the surface air that had numbed her cheeks during the 30-yard walk from house to shed. This was different, alive in a way that winter air is not alive, carrying the particular warmth of earth that has been holding its temperature against the season's pressure, releasing stored heat in increments so small they are invisible to any instrument except the human palm. She climbed down the 8 steps, stood in the pit. The lamplight caught the crocks, the jars, the cedar box, everything in its place, undisturbed since September, sitting in the same patient rows she had arranged them in. She held her bare hand at chest height, fingers open, feeling the air. 41 degrees, maybe 42, the precision did not matter. What mattered was the distance between that number, the one posted on the porch, 14 below. 55 degrees of separation. 55 degrees created not by combustion, not by any expenditure of fuel, not by any human effort beyond the initial construction, but by the earth itself, doing what it has always done, what it did before there were thermometers to measure it or sellers to exploit it, holding summer, releasing it slowly, refusing to surrender to a season that demanded everything above the surface freeze on command. The potato sacks were dry. She pressed her thumb into the nearest burlap, the fabric cold but not frozen, the tuber beneath it firm, dense with the stored starch of a summer-growing season that felt like it belonged to a different year, a different life. The lard in the crocks was solid but yielded when she pressed the surface with a knuckle, scoopable, workable, the consistency of butter left on a kitchen counter in April. The jars of pickled beets sat in their row with the brine clear, undisturbed, the wax seals intact. Nothing had shifted, nothing had cracked, nothing had frozen. She allowed herself a moment not of celebration, not of pride, but of something quieter that occupied the space between those things. Recognition. The system was performing. The theory had become fact. The lesson had become architecture. She climbed back up, replaced the hatch, stacked the birch into its rows, walked to the house to make supper. During the walk, the cold found every gap in her coat, every exposed inch of skin above her collar. Every breath she exhaled, crystallizing it into a brief cloud that hung in the air behind her like punctuation at the end of a sentence she had not spoken aloud. Inside, she lit the kitchen range, heated water. 8 potatoes she had kept in the house. The cellar stores were for later, for January, for the long siege that Marsh's quiet warning, the early geese, the fat on the elk, all pointed toward. She was rationing time the way she rationed firewood, spending only what the current day required, saving the rest for days when the cost of survival would be higher. December continued. The temperature settled into a pattern that was not a pattern, more like a staircase ascending, each step lower than the last, each landing shorter before the next drop. -8 on the 12th, -17 on the 15th. A brief reprieve on the 20th, when the thermometer climbed to 4 above zero, a temperature that felt almost tropical by the standard the month had established, then back down. -12 on Christmas Day, which Astrid observed by eating a piece of salt pork from the house stores, drinking a cup of coffee she had been saving since Thanksgiving, sitting in the parlor beside the stove with a blanket around her shoulders, reading a 3-month-old newspaper from Buffalo that contained nothing relevant to her situation, except the fact of its existence, evidence that somewhere beyond the frozen perimeter of her property, people were still printing words on paper, still caring about county elections, still advertising horse tack at prices she could not afford. She checked the cellar twice in December beyond that first visit. Both times 41 degrees, both times everything intact. Both times the air rising through the hatch with that particular quality, cool but not hostile, moist but not damp, carrying the stored warmth of a summer that had ended 3 months ago on the surface but continued, uninterrupted, in the stone 9 feet below. January arrived the way a creditor arrives, not with noise but with presence. The temperature on the morning of January 1st was 22 below. The sky was the color of sheet metal, uniform gray from horizon to horizon, pressing down on the valley with the particular weight of a sky that has nothing left to give, no snow, no wind, no variation, simply the unbroken pressure of cold air sitting on the landscape like a hand pressing down on something it intends to hold still. The creek had been frozen solid since mid-November. Astrid's water supply was snowmelt, heated on the range in a cast-iron pot that she filled by scooping packed snow from the drift along the north wall of the house, the same drift she had fought all autumn, shoveling it away from the foundation to prevent meltwater from seeping into the crawl space. Now the drift was useful. Everything is useful if the season is desperate enough to recategorize it. She ran the house on 3 fires. The kitchen range, a cast-iron Monarch she had bought secondhand from a family leaving the territory in 1882, its firebox deep enough for split pine up to 16 inches, its top hot enough to boil water in 12 minutes at full draft. The parlor stove, a smaller box design with a single damper, positioned in the center of the main room where it could radiate heat in all directions, though all directions was optimistic, since the north wall absorbed warmth the way a sponge absorbs water, pulling it out of the room faster than the stove could produce it. The bedroom stove, smallest of the three, a sheet metal box on legs that Emmett had built from salvaged parts in their third winter, crude but functional, its only purpose to keep the water bucket from freezing solid overnight, which it accomplished at the cost of approximately 1 armload of split pine per 8 hours, 3 fires, 3 fuel demands, 3 mouths eating through the woodpile at a rate Astrid tracked in her journal with the precision of an accountant tracking receivables. 2 loads to the parlor stove per day, 1.5 to the kitchen range, including cooking. 1 load to the bedroom stove, fed at 10 o'clock at night, burning down to coals by 6 in the morning, the bucket temperature hovering at 34 degrees when she woke 2 degrees above freezing, the narrowest possible margin, held through the night by a stove the size of a bread box burning wood she could not afford to waste. Cold at that intensity draws heat out of a house through the walls the way a wick draws kerosene from a lamp constantly, without, through every crack, every gap, every inch of surface where the interior temperature meets the exterior temperature, the two separated by nothing more than 4 inches of pine lumber, a layer of tar paper Emmett had tacked on during their 4th year. Whatever chinking remained intact from Astrid's autumn repairs, the house was not insulated in any meaningful sense. It was enclosed. Enclosure keeps wind out, insulation keeps heat in. Astrid's house did the first adequately. It did the second barely, insufficiently, with a constant low-grade hemorrhage of warmth that she could feel whenever she stood near an exterior wall, a draft not strong enough to move a candle flame but strong enough to remind her, every hour of every day, that the structure she lived in was losing the battle by degrees so small they were invisible, so constant they were inevitable. By January 12th, the morning reading was 29 below. By evening, it was 33 below. The mail rider who had been coming through from Gillette every Tuesday, the only regular link between Astrid's property, the outside world, had not appeared since January 4th. The road was impassable. Drifts 6 feet deep blocked the low spots where the wagon track crossed the drainage draws between her property, Gillette. The rider's horse, even a strong one accustomed to Wyoming winters, could not break trail through consolidated snow at temperatures that froze the moisture in an animal's nostrils shut within minutes of exposure. Astrid was alone. Not metaphorically, she had been metaphorically alone since October of 1885, since the morning Emmett's breathing changed, since the pale blue sky that followed the rain. Now she was alone in the operational sense, the logistical sense, the sense that means no one is coming for any reason, helpful or otherwise, until the weather relents. No one would check on her. No one would bring news. No one would know if she ran out of wood, if the house caught fire, if she fell on the ice between the house, the barn, broke something that could not be repaired without another pair of hands. She marked the days in her journal. Not with narrative, she was not a woman who narrated her experience to herself in writing. Not out of lack of ability, but out of lack of purpose, since the audience for a diary entry written on a homestead in Wyoming territory in January of 1887 was exactly one person. The person writing it, who already knew what had happened because she was the one it had happened to. She marked dates, temperatures, fuel consumed, cellar readings. January 12th, -29, cellar 40. January 13th, -31, cellar 40. January 14th, -38, cellar 40. The numbers told a story more clearly than any sentence could. On the surface, the world was descending. Below the shed the world held. January 14th was when the real cold arrived, not the testing cold of December. Not the incremental cold of early January descending its staircase one step at a time. This was different. This was the floor dropping out. The atmospheric pattern that had been building for weeks, a high-pressure ridge anchored over the northern plains, fed by Arctic air flowing south from the Canadian interior, locked into position over Wyoming territory like a door closing. The cold did not fluctuate. It did not moderate at midday. It did not lift overnight to a slightly less murderous altitude before descending again at dawn. It simply sat, immovable, impersonal, pressing down on the landscape with a weight that was not physical but felt physical, the way silence has weight, the way darkness has density, the way grief has mass that you carry in your body long after the event that produced it has passed. 38 below on the morning of the 14th, 40 below by nightfall. On the 15th, Astrid walked to the porch at dawn, read the thermometer, walked back inside. She did not record the number immediately. She sat at the kitchen table, stared at the stove, then opened the journal, wrote -44. At 44 below zero, the physics of cold become visible. Breath does not drift. It crystallizes a faint shimmer of ice particles appearing in the air in front of your face, falling rather than floating, descending in a slow curtain of microscopic crystals that catch whatever light is available, turning exhaled air into something that looks almost beautiful if you are the kind of person who finds beauty in the mechanisms of your own mortality. Exposed skin loses sensation in under 4 minutes. The moisture in your eyes, the thin film of tears that keeps the cornea lubricated, begins to thicken at the edges, creating a slight blurring of peripheral vision that feels like the early stages of blindness, but is simply your body's fluid dynamics responding to a temperature that living tissue was not designed to occupy. The ponderosa pines on the north slope made sounds at night. Not the creaking of wind-stressed wood, there was no wind. The high-pressure system had killed the wind as thoroughly as it had killed the warmth. The sounds were rifle cracks, sharp, percussive, arriving without warning from the darkness at unpredictable intervals. Sap inside the frozen trunks expanding faster than the wood fiber could accommodate, splitting the bark along the grain in vertical fractures that ran 3 feet, sometimes 4, the exposed heartwood pale against the dark bark in the morning light, weeping frozen amber where the sap had bled before crystallizing. Clear Creek, frozen since November, groaned under the new pressure. The ice, already thick enough to walk on, to drive a horse across, was being compressed from both directions now. The cold above pushing down, the residual warmth of the creek bed below pushing up, creating stresses in the ice sheet that released in deep, resonant pulses. Astrid could hear from her kitchen at 3 in the morning. The sound traveled through the frozen ground the way sound travels through railroad rails, faster, cleaner, more present than through air. Lying in bed at night, she could feel the creek's distress through the floor, through the frame of the house, through the frozen earth that connected every structure on the property to every other structure in a network of rigid, ice-bonded soil that transmitted vibration the way a telegraph wire transmits signal. The hinges on the barn door froze open on the morning of the 16th. Iron does not freeze in the conventional sense. It does not solidify from liquid the way water does. But the moisture that lubricates the pivot point of a hinge, the thin film of water that exists between any two metal surfaces exposed to atmosphere, freezes at 32 degrees. At 44 below, that film does not merely freeze, it bonds. The iron surfaces of the hinge become welded to each other by a layer of ice so thin it is invisible, so strong it resists the full force of a woman pulling with both hands braced against the doorframe. Astrid freed the hinges with a candle flame held against the pivot for 20 minutes, the wax dripping onto the frozen iron in pale yellow streaks that cooled to opacity before they reached the bottom of the hinge plate. She was burning wood faster than planned. The calculations she had made in October 4 chords for 12 weeks of hard cold had been based on the assumption that hard cold meant sustained temperatures in the minus teens, with occasional dips into the minus 20s. What she was experiencing now was a category she had not calculated for because she had not believed it possible outside of stories told by men who had been in the territory longer than she had, stories she had categorized as the particular exaggeration that settlers used to establish seniority over newcomers, converting experience into mythology the way banks convert deposits into leverage. The mythology was accurate, the stories were not exaggerated. Minus 44 was not a story. It was a number she had read with her own eye on her own thermometer on her own porch. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the mercury column contracted to a thin silver wire barely visible in the pre-dawn dark, sitting at a mark on the glass tube that she had never seen it reach before, never imagined it reaching, never built her fuel calculations to accommodate. She rationed 2 loads to the parlor stove instead of 3. The kitchen range only during cooking hours, the hour before each meal, the hour after, then dampened to a slow smolder that kept the iron warm but did not consume wood at the full draft rate. The bedroom stove she debated eliminating entirely, redirecting that fuel to the parlor where she could sleep on the floor beside the stove, wrapped in every blanket she owned. She decided against it. The water bucket in the bedroom was her only overnight water supply. If it froze, she would need to start the range at 4 in the morning to melt snow for drinking water, consuming fuel she had saved by eliminating the bedroom stove. The math ate its own tail. Every conservation measure created a new cost somewhere else. Every door she closed opened a window. Survival in extreme cold is not a problem of resources. It is a problem of resource allocation, a continuous series of decisions about which loss you can tolerate in order to prevent the loss you cannot. Each morning she checked the cellar. The routine was precise, developed not through planning but through the body's need for ritual, when the external world offers nothing but the same unrelenting condition repeated without variation. Wake at 5:30, feed the bedroom stove, dress in the dark, walk to the kitchen, feed the range, heat water. Drink 1 cup of coffee, the ration unchanged since December. 1 cup no more, the small indulgence she permitted herself as proof that discipline was a choice rather than a deprivation. Then the coat, the gloves, the scarf wound twice around her face with only her eyes exposed. Walk to the shed, 30 yards. The cold, finding every gap in the wrapping within 3 strides. Move the wood, open the hatch, descend. On the 3rd day of the deep cold, she climbed down the steps at 5:40 in the morning, pre-dawn dark. The lamp casting a circle of yellow light that reached the far wall of the cellar, illuminating the crocks in their row, the jars with their wax seals, the cedar box in the corner, the burlap sacks along the east wall where the fieldstone gave off a barely perceptible warmth. 41 degrees. The thermometer she had hung on the wall, the second mercury instrument twin to the one on the porch, confirmed it. 41 inside, 44 below outside. A differential of 85 degrees separated by 9 feet of earth, a layer of fieldstone, a layer of hay, a sheet of waxed canvas, 12 inches of compacted subsoil, a floor of split pine that no one walked on, rows of firewood that no one questioned. The stone floor was cool under her boots but not cold. Not the aggressive cold of the surface which attacked the soles of her feet through the leather within minutes of stepping outside. This was different, a passive coolness, the temperature of earth at rest, earth at equilibrium, earth that was not being asked to do anything except what it had always done, hold steady. The walls were dry, no condensation, no frost, no sign that the moisture in the air was approaching the dew point. The hay insulation above was performing, keeping the warm air below separated from the cold air above, the canvas barrier preventing snowmelt from penetrating downward to compress the hay, the entire layered system functioning as an integrated whole. She stood in the cellar for 5 minutes. Not inspecting, she had inspected. Everything was intact. She stood there because the cellar was the only space on her property where her body was not under assault. The house was cold, survivably cold, functionally cold, but cold in the constant draining way that reminded her every moment that the structure was losing its war with the atmosphere. The barn was worse. The shed was open to the elements. It's on one side. The outhouse was a brief, miserable necessity she completed as fast as anatomically possible. The cellar was the only place where winter was not winning. On the 7th night of the deep cold January 20th, Astrid woke at 3 in the morning, not from noise, not from cold, though the bedroom stove had burned down to a bed of coals barely visible through the draft slot, the room temperature somewhere in the 30s. She woke from a feeling she could not name, a pressure behind her breastbone, a tightness that was not physical pain but resembled it, the way a shadow resembles the object that casts it. She dressed, coat, gloves, scarf, took the lamp, walked to the shed in darkness so complete that the lamplight seemed not to illuminate the ground but to create it each step, producing a circle of visible earth that disappeared the moment the lamp moved forward, as though the ground existed only where she was standing, dissolving into nothing in every direction she was not looking. The porch thermometer on her way past. She stopped, held the lamp close to the glass. Read the number twice, because the first reading seemed like an error of perception, a trick played by cold contracted mercury in inadequate light, -52. She stared at the number the way you stare at a sentence in a letter that changes the meaning of everything written before it. -52 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature at which exposed flesh freezes in under 2 minutes, a temperature at which iron becomes brittle enough to shatter under a hammer blow. A temperature at which the boundary between solid liquid dissolves into a continuum of states that chemistry textbooks treat as theoretical. She continued to the shed, moved the wood, opened the hatch, climbed down. The air that rose to meet her was the same air that had risen to meet her every morning. For the past week, the same air that had risen to meet her at 8 years old in Dolly's Hollow. The same air that had risen to meet every person who had ever climbed down into a properly constructed underground cellar in any century, on any continent, in any winter. Cool, moist, patient, carrying the particular warmth of earth that has been asked to do only one thing: hold what it has doing it, with the passive competence of a material that has been performing this function for longer than human beings have been alive to measure it. She hung the lamp, read the thermometer on the wall. The mercury sat at the 39-degree mark, a degree lower than it had been in December, a degree lower than the first week of January, a degree lower than the average she had been tracking in her journal since October. 1 degree. In 60 days of winter, the cellar had surrendered a single degree of temperature. The surface above it had dropped from 38 degrees in late September to 52 below zero at this moment, a swing of 90 degrees. The cellar had moved one. She opened the journal. The pencil was cold in her fingers, the graphite core contracted enough that the writing was thinner than usual, a fine gray line on the ruled page. She wrote 2 numbers, by a slash, -39. Below, without planning to, without deciding to. She wrote a third number, 91 degrees of difference. Created by 9 feet of depth, a lining of creekstone, a floor of fire-heated fieldstone, a roof of pine planks, under hay, under canvas, under earth, under a floor of split firewood, under a cedar shake roof on an open-faced shed at the northeast corner of a 100-acre homestead in Johnson County, Wyoming Territory, in the worst winter in the memory of every person alive in the valley. Her hand shook as she wrote, not from cold, the cellar was 39 degrees. Her hand shook from something else, the specific tremor that comes when you see a thing you built with your own hands perform exactly the function you built it to perform, under conditions more extreme than you designed it for, without failure, without compromise, without asking for anything you did not give it months ago when the ground was soft, the air was warm, the work was hard, but the purpose was clear. She closed the journal, sat on the bottom step. The silence in the cellar was absolute, not the dead silence of an empty room, but the living silence of a space that is doing its work quietly, the way bones do their work quietly, the way roots do their work quietly, the way every load-bearing structure in nature performs its function without announcing it. She sat for 10 minutes, maybe longer. The lamp flame wavered once when a shift of air pressure from above, a gust on the surface, transmitted faintly through the hatch seams, reached the cellar floor with just enough force to disturb a flame, but not enough to extinguish it. She climbed up, replaced the hatch, stacked the wood, walked to the house. The cold took back everything the cellar had given her within seconds. Cheek warmth gone by the 3rd step, finger sensation gone by the 5th, the membranes of her nostrils tightening, beginning to freeze, by the time she reached the kitchen door. She went inside, fed the range, heated water, sat at the table with her hands around the cup, the same gesture she had performed in September, on the night the cellar was finished, the night she had sat in the dark below the woodshed for the first time without fear. The cup cooled. She did not refill it. She opened the journal again, looked at the 3 numbers she had written by lamplight 9 feet below the ground, -52, 39, 91. Then she closed it, put it in the drawer beside the stove, began the day. 91 degrees of difference. The earth does not fight the cold, it waits the cold out. The 9th day was when the second crisis arrived. Not the crisis she had prepared for, the cellar handled that. This was the crisis she had not prepared for because it was not hers to control, because it belonged to a body she did not own, could not reason with, could not warm by placing it 9 feet underground wrapped in burlap. Flint. Astrid had been checking the cow 3 times daily since the deep cold began. Dawn, midday, dusk, the same rotation she used for the stove fires, the same discipline of interval that kept every system on the property running within the narrow margins that separated function from failure. Extra hay each morning forked from the loft into the feeding rack at a rate that exceeded what Flint could eat in a day, the excess left deliberately to create a layer of loose hay on the floor around the animal's hooves, insulating the packed earth floor the way the hay in the cellar roof insulated the planks above it. A bucket of warmed water carried from the kitchen range twice daily, heated, not to comfort, but to prevent the animal's core temperature from dropping each time she drank, which is what happens when a cow in a cold barn drinks water that is 32 degrees, which is all water can be when the ambient temperature in the barn is hovering in the teens. The barn was board and batten construction from their first year on the property. Emmett had built it for adequacy, not for extremity, sized for 2 horses, a cow, whatever poultry survived the foxes, insulated by nothing except its own walls, whatever residual warmth the animals generated among themselves. For ordinary Wyoming winters, which is to say winters that reached the minus teens, held there for a week or 2, then relented, the barn temperature stabilized between 15-20 degrees above zero. Uncomfortable for livestock, but not dangerous. Cattle are warm-blooded engines that convert feed into body heat, with an efficiency that has been refined by 10,000 years of domestication in cold climates. A healthy cow carrying good autumn weight, eating adequate hay, drinking water that is not ice, can maintain core body temperature through extended cold that would kill an unprotected human in hours. For 8 days, Flint had managed. Her weight was down. Astrid could see it in the sharpening of the hip bones visible above the flank when she turned, the slight concavity behind the rib cage that appears when a ruminant is metabolizing body fat faster than feed can replace it. But the breathing was steady. The eyes were clear. The water consumption was adequate. The animal stood squarely on all 4 legs when eating, shifted weight normally when resting, showed no signs of the progressive withdrawal that indicates a body beginning to lose its thermoregulatory battle. On the morning of January 22nd, the 9th day, Astrid opened the barn door, stepped inside, felt the difference immediately. Not the temperature itself. Temperature takes a moment to register. The body needs time to distinguish between its expectation of cold based on what it felt yesterday, the actual cold it is feeling now. What she felt instantly was the quality of the air, dense, still. The particular stillness that is not peaceful, but pressurized, the stillness of a room where something has stopped working, where the balance between heat production, heat loss has tipped past the point of equilibrium into a deficit that is accumulating with each passing hour. The thermometer on the center post. She walked to it, already knowing what it would say in the way that a person who has been reading the same instrument for 7 years knows its answer before reading it, not the specific number, but the range, the direction, the severity. 9 degrees above zero. 9 above. The barn had dropped 6 degrees since the previous evening's reading of 15. 6 degrees in 14 hours, in a structure that had been losing the same battle as the house, the same slow hemorrhage of warmth through inadequate walls, but without the advantage of 3 fires fed every few hours, without the constant replenishment of heat that kept the house habitable by the standard of habitability that Astrid had been operating under for 3 weeks, which was a standard so low it would have been unrecognizable to any person accustomed to heated shelter. Flint stood at the far wall, head lowered. Not the casual lowered head of a cow resting between meals, the compressive posture of an animal pulling inward, drawing its energy toward its core the way a fire draws oxygen toward its center, sacrificing the periphery to preserve the essential. Her breathing was shallow, quick. The rhythm was wrong, too fast for rest, too regular for distress, occupying the intermediate state that veterinarians call compensated hypothermia, which means the body is still winning but is aware it is losing, pulling resources from every non-essential system to maintain the one system that matters, which is circulation to the vital organs. The water in the trough had frozen solid, not a skin of ice on the surface frozen through. Despite the floating block of wood Astrid kept in it to absorb surface tension, slow the freezing process by providing a thermal mass that ice had to work around rather than through. The block sat in the center of the frozen trough like a monument to a strategy that had reached its limit. Astrid walked to the cow, pressed her palm against the left flank behind the shoulder where the hide is thinnest, where body heat radiates most readily through the skin. The warmth she felt there was thin, not absent thin. The attenuated warmth of a body that is performing the metabolic equivalent of a fighting retreat, surrendering ground in order to preserve the positions it cannot afford to lose. She moved her hand down the left foreleg. At the hock the warmth disappeared entirely. Below the hock, the cannon bone, the fetlock, the hoof, the leg was cold in a way that living tissue should not be cold, the temperature of the bone indistinguishable from the temperature of the air surrounding it. She knelt, pressed both hands around the fetlock joint. Cold. Not frozen, the animal's minimal circulation was preventing actual tissue death, but cold enough that the joint moved stiffly when she flexed it, the synovial fluid inside thickened by temperature to the consistency of cold grease, the tendons reluctant, the whole mechanism operating at a fraction of its designed capacity. 9 above zero, 2 more days before any break was likely. 48 hours of 9-degree air in a structure that could not be heated, surrounding an animal that was burning through her reserves faster than Astrid could replace them with hay. Astrid stood in the barn doorway, looked at the woodshed 30 feet across the yard, looked at the gap between the two structures, the 4-foot space where the east wall of the barn, the west wall of the shed came close enough to touch if you stood in the middle with your arms extended, the gap that Emmett had talked about closing with a connecting passage during their 3rd year. A project for spring, he had said, a weekend of work, a few boards, a few nails, a crossbeam for the roof. A thing that would make winter chores easier, moving between barn, woodshed, without crossing open ground. They had never gotten to it. Spring had come with its own priorities. Summer consumed what spring did not. By autumn, the project had migrated from the list of things to do this year to the list of things to do next year, where it remained undone until the list itself became irrelevant because the man who had written it was dead. The gap. 4 feet of open air between two structures. 4 feet through which the northwest wind drove in sustained flat gusts that came around the north end of the ridge with nothing to slow them, arriving at the gap like water arriving at a drain, accelerating through the narrow space, creating a Venturi effect that pulled warm air from the barn's interior through every crack, every gap between boards, every loose batten that Emmett's first-year construction had left imperfect. The gap was not the only reason the barn was 9 degrees. But the gap was the reason the barn was 9 degrees instead of 15. Which was the difference between an animal that was compensating, struggling but stable, versus an animal that was decompensating, burning through the last reserves of a body that had been asked to fight a war it was not equipped for. Astrid did not stand in the doorway for long. The cold did not allow deliberation of the kind that happens in warm rooms, where options can be weighed at leisure, pros, cons balanced against each other in the comfortable silence of a space that is not actively trying to kill you. The cold demanded a decision, not the best decision, not the optimal decision, but the sufficient one. The decision that addresses the immediate threat with the materials immediately at hand, in the time immediately available, with the energy that remains after 3 weeks of rationing, have reduced every reserve to its minimum functional level. She worked with what she had. 2 hay bales from the barn loft, the last full bales, the rest having been broken open for Flint's feeding over the past weeks. She unwired them, opened them into loose mass, a compressed brick of dried grass expanding into a shapeless mound that smelled of the summer meadow it had been cut from July. Hot, the sound of the scythe through timothy grass, the sweat running down her forearms as she raked the windrows into piles for curing. That summer felt like a rumor, a story someone had told her about a place she had never visited. A second piece of waxed canvas, the remnant from the cellar construction, 12 feet long, folded in the shed rafters since September. 4 lengths of rough-sawn 2x6, also stored overhead, saved for a project she had not yet identified, the reflexive stockpiling of useful material that every homesteader practices because the alternative needing something you do not have, in a place where obtaining it requires a day's travel in conditions that may not permit travel, is a failure that can cascade into catastrophe. A spool of baling wire, a hammer, a box of 8-penny nails, these were her materials. These were what stood between a 4-foot gap, the 9-degree air that was killing her cow by degrees too small to see, too constant to stop. She built a barrier. Not a wall. She did not have the lumber for a wall, did not have the time, did not have the skill for the kind of tight-joined construction that would qualify as a wall by any carpenter's standard. What she built was an obstruction, a refusal. A physical statement made of compressed grass, waxed canvas, rough lumber, baling wire that communicated a single idea to the wind: not through here. The hay bales, broken open, compressed by hand into the gap's width. Not stuffed, packed the way her father had packed the hay in the cellar roof, dense enough to hold its shape under compression, airy enough to trap dead air in the spaces between the grass stems. Each handful pressed into the gap, tamped down with her fist, then her elbow, then her boot. When the accumulation reached a height she could no longer reach with her hands, the canvas stretched over the compressed hay on the windward side, the side facing northwest, facing the wind, facing the full force of whatever the Canadian Arctic was sending down the plains at this moment. She nailed the canvas into the wooden walls on both sides with 8-penny nails driven at angles that bit into the grain of the barn's east wall, the shed's west wall, pulling the canvas taut against the hay, creating a membrane that wind could press against but not penetrate. The 2x6s she braced diagonally across the gap, one at each end, nailed into both structures at angles that triangulated the force of the wind against the structural strength of buildings that had been standing for 7 years. The braces would not survive a tornado. They would survive a 30-mile-per-hour sustained gust from the northwest, which was what the gap had been channeling into the barn for 9 days. The work took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Her fingers went numb twice. Both times she stopped, walked into the barn, pressed her hands against Flint's neck, the one area where the cow's body still generated enough surface warmth to be useful as a heat source for human fingers. She stood with her cheek against the animal's shoulder, feeling the slow, deliberate breathing, the ribcage expanding, contracting the rhythm of a body that was still trying, still converting hay into heat, still maintaining the metabolic fire that separates a living animal from the carcass it will become when the fire goes out. Her fingers tingled, burned, regained enough sensation to grip a hammer. She went back to the gap. What she was doing was not complicated. She understood this with the clarity that comes when a problem has been stripped of everything theoretical. She was not warming the barn. She had nothing to warm it with. She could not safely run a fire in a board and batten structure full of loose hay, housing a large animal that could panic at the smell of smoke. She could not move the cow into the house. She could not move the house closer to the barn. She could not negotiate with the weather, appeal to the temperature, petition the high-pressure system sitting over northern Wyoming to move along. What she could do was reduce the rate at which cold entered, seal the gap, cut the draft, stop the wind from stripping the residual warmth from the barn's interior faster than Flint's body could replace it. The mathematics of insulation: every gap sealed is a loss prevented, every layer added between a living body, a killing wind, is degrees recovered at no fuel cost. By mid-afternoon, working with no instrument more precise than her own hand held at shoulder height, she estimated the barn had risen to 13 degrees above zero. 4 degrees. 4 degrees created not by adding heat but by subtracting wind. 4 degrees that cost nothing except 1 hour and 40 minutes of labor. 2 hay bales, a piece of salvaged canvas, 4 boards, a handful of nails, the kind of baling wire that every homestead in the territory had coiled on a nail in the barn. Flint was standing squarely on all 4 legs. The breathing had deepened, steadied the rhythm, shifting from the rapid, shallow compensatory pattern back toward the slower cadence of an animal whose thermoregulatory system has been given something to work with. Not comfort, not warmth, just less cold, just enough reduction in heat loss to tip the balance back from deficit to equilibrium, the narrow, fragile equilibrium that separates an animal that is coping from one that is failing. Astrid brought 2 buckets of hot water from the range. Carrying them across the yard required a particular technique she had developed over 3 weeks of practice, arms wrapped around the buckets, pulling them tight against her torso, her body heat insulating the water from the air during the transit. Even so, the water temperature dropped 15 degrees between range, barn arriving warm but no longer hot, a lukewarm offering that would have been insulting in any other context, but was, under these circumstances, the difference between a cow that drank, a cow that did not. Flint drank both buckets. Long, deliberate pulls, the muzzle submerged to the nostrils, the throat working in slow rhythmic contractions that Astrid could see from across the barn, the visible mechanics of an animal taking in the one thing its body needed more than heat, more than hay, more than shelter, water. Warm enough to drink without lowering core temperature, delivered by a woman who had carried it 30 yards through air, cold enough to freeze it solid in 9 minutes if she had stopped walking. By evening, the barn was 14 degrees, holding. The gap sealed. The wind redirected around the structures rather than through them. Flint moved to the hay rack on her own, not led, not coaxed, walking under her own power with the cautious deliberation of an animal testing joints that had been stiff for hours, finding them functional, finding the ground solid, finding the hay where it was supposed to be. That was the last signal Astrid needed. She went inside, fed the stoves, ate, slept. Slept in the particular way that exhaustion produces, not restfully but completely. The body shutting down non-essential consciousnesses the way a furnace shuts down non-essential draft when fuel is low, preserving what remains for the next ignition, the next day, the next crisis that may or may not arrive with the dawn. The cold broke on the 23rd. Not sharply, it never breaks sharply in January in that valley, the way it never breaks sharply anywhere that cold has established occupation, rather than merely passing through. A shift moved in overnight, a weakness in the high-pressure ridge, a fracture in the atmospheric pattern that had held the territory in place for 9 days, motionless under the weight of air so cold it had killed livestock across 3 counties, frozen the earth to depths that would not thaw until May, split trees, silenced creeks, burned through fuel reserves that families had spent all autumn accumulating. The morning thermometer read 28 below instead of 44. 16 degrees of difference that felt, after 9 days of sustained assault, like a door opening into a warm room which it was not even close, 28 below being a temperature that would have alarmed Astrid in any other January. But context recalibrates perception. After 52 below, 28 below felt like something close to mercy. By the 28th, the valley was back to single digits below zero. By early February, what the old-timers at the Gillette trading post would later call the big die-up had entered the phase that follows every catastrophe, the accounting phase, the phase where the survivors stand in the wreckage of whatever the event has destroyed, count what remains, begin the slow mathematics of recovery. Astrid stood at the kitchen window on the morning of February 1st. The thermometer read 4 below. The sun was out, not warm but present, a pale disk above the eastern ridge that cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, the shadows blue against the white in a way that made the landscape look like a painting of itself, a representation of the place she lived rather than the place itself. Flint was visible through the barn door she had left open for the first time in 3 weeks, standing in the rectangle of sunlight that fell through the opening, her breath rising in slow plumes that caught the light, drifted south, dissolved. The hay barrier in the gap between barns shed was still standing. The canvas had torn along the upper edge where the wind had worked at the nail heads, loosening 2 of them enough to allow a flap of material to lift, snap in the gusts that came around the ridge. The hay beneath was compressed to half its original thickness, packed by wind pressure into a dense mat that had lost most of its insulating value but retained its function as a windbreak, which was the function that mattered. Astrid looked at the barrier, looked at the barn, looked at the cow standing in the sunlight. The world above ground had nearly killed everything she owned. The world below it, 9 feet of earth, stone, hay, canvas, had held without moving. She turned from the window, opened the journal, wrote the date, the temperature, survived. Then closed it, put the kettle on, began the day. When the roads opened, Gideon Marsh was the first visitor. Not the first person Astrid saw after the cold broke that was one of the Dawes brothers, the younger one, who rode past on the morning of January 30th without stopping, lifting a hand from the saddle in the universal gesture of a man confirming that another person is alive without requiring a conversation about it. Not the first sign of returning normalcy that was the mail rider, who appeared on February 2nd with a canvas sack of letters, newspapers 3 weeks stale, a verbal report of conditions in the valley that was more comprehensive than anything printed, because printed news traveled at the speed of typesetting, while spoken news traveled at the speed of a man on horseback who had spent 2 days riding from homestead to homestead collecting the kind of information that does not appear in newspapers. Who lost what? Who survived on what? Who was still unaccounted for? Marsh came on the 4th of February. The temperature had stabilized at single digits below zero, which was ordinary February weather, the kind of cold that Johnson County understood how to absorb uncomfortable, manageable, belonging to the category of winter that tests patience rather than survival. Snow still covered every surface, but the quality of the light had changed. February light in Wyoming is different from January light, the way a recovering patient's face is different from a dying one, the same features, the same structure, but something behind it has shifted. Some internal pressure has eased, some surrender has been reversed. His wagon came up the lane at the pace of a man who is not in a hurry because hurry implies purpose. Purpose implies a plan. A plan implies a future orientation that Gideon Marsh did not appear to possess on that particular morning. The horse moved at a walk. Marsh sat on the bench seat, with his shoulders rounded forward in a posture Astrid had not seen on him before, not the upright, squared positioning of a man who has survived 60 years on the northern plains by refusing to concede anything to gravity, weather, circumstance, or the opinions of people younger than himself. This was different. Something had been taken from the architecture of his body, something structural. He stopped the wagon in the yard, did not climb down immediately, sat on the bench looking at the woodshed the way a man looks at a locked door when he suspects what is behind it, but is not yet ready to confirm the suspicion. Astrid came out of the house. She stood on the porch in her coat, watching Marsh sit in his wagon, watching him look at the shed, reading the silence between them the way she read the temperature of air, not the specific content, but the quality, the weight, the direction. He climbed down, stood in the yard, removed his hat, held it in both hands in front of his belt, turning it slowly by the brim. But there was something different about the gesture now. The rotation was slower, his hands were less certain. The hat moved in his grip as though he had forgotten why he was holding it. "Your stores come through?" His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Yes." He nodded, a single dip of the chin that continued downward slightly past the point where a normal nod reverses, as though his head was reluctant to come back up, as though the act of raising his chin required effort that he was not certain he had. "Your cow? She is fine." Another silence, longer than the first. The horse shifted in the traces, adjusting its weight from one hind leg to the other, the creak of leather filling the space between two people standing in a frozen yard, trying to have a conversation that neither of them had a vocabulary for. Marsh looked at the shed again, then at the ground, then at Astrid. Denton did not make it 4 words, delivered with the economy of a man who has already said them enough times that the syllables have worn smooth, losing their edges, the way creekstones lose their edges, not through any intentional process, but through the simple repetition of contact between the word, the air it passes through. His oldest, 26 years old, a tall young man who looked like his father in the way that sons look like their fathers in communities where the gene pool is narrow, the faces repeat, the jawlines recur across generations like a motif in a piece of music that returns at intervals just frequent enough to be recognized. She waited. Marsh would tell her what he chose to tell her, in the order he chose to tell it, at the pace his grief permitted. She would not prompt. She would not ask. She had learned, in the months since Emmett's death, that grief has its own chronology. It releases information on its own schedule, in its own sequence, with a logic that makes sense only to the person carrying it. Their cellar froze on the 5th day. His voice had the mechanical quality of a man reciting facts he has organized into a sequence for the purpose of transmission. Potatoes went first, then the cabbage, then everything except the jarred stores, which held another 2 days before the glass cracked. The Marsh cellar was a hillside dugout, similar in design to the one Emmett had built, 14 feet long, facing northwest. The same fundamental inadequacy that Astrid had identified 3 years ago in her own cellar, the same vulnerability to sustained cold that she had addressed by digging deeper, lining with stone, sealing with canvas over hay, burying under 12 inches of subsoil beneath a woodshed floor that no one thought to question. Denton had been unwell before the cold arrived. A cough that had started in late December, the kind of persistent bronchial inflammation that settles into the chest of a young man working outdoors in cold air, eating a diet that has been restricted by the loss of half the family's winter stores to a frozen cellar. Not serious under normal circumstances. Serious when rest is impossible because the livestock need tending in temperatures that assault the lungs with every breath. Serious when warm food is unavailable because the stores that would have provided it are frozen solid. Serious when time runs out because the human body, weakened by cold exposure, inadequate nutrition, respiratory compromise, reaches a threshold beyond which the accumulation of small deficits becomes a single large failure, the way a bridge does not collapse from any single vehicle, but from the accumulated weight of every vehicle that has crossed it since the last inspection. Denton died on the 25th of January, the 11th day of the deep cold. 2 days after the temperature broke, his body had run out of whatever reserve had been sustaining it through the worst of the siege, the way a lamp runs out of kerosene not during the storm, but in the calm after the last of the fuel consumed during the emergency, leaving nothing for the recovery. Marsh had dug the grave himself, 6 hours with a pickaxe, a pry bar, a shovel that bounced off the frozen surface like a hammer bouncing off an anvil. The ground was frozen to a depth of 4 feet. Below 4 feet, the earth softened enough to accept a blade still cold, still resistant, but yielding in increments that made the work possible, if not tolerable. He did not describe the burial. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking at the woodshed, carrying the weight of a fact that no amount of describing would make lighter. That hole under the shed. His voice shifted register, rising slightly from the flat monotone into something that resembled the voice of a practical man asking a practical question. A man who has absorbed a loss cannot undo it, can only prevent its repetition. Can you show me? She walked to the shed. Marsh followed. She moved the birch from the third row piece by piece, the same deliberate process she performed every time. The hatch appeared. The leather strap, she pulled it open, the air rose from below. Marsh felt it. She watched his face as the warmth reached him, the slight widening of the eyes, the involuntary parting of the lips, the almost imperceptible forward lean of a body responding to something it did not expect. He had been standing in 4-degree air. The cellar was breathing 40-degree air into his face, the difference between hostility, neutrality, between air that is trying to take something from you, air that is simply present. She went down first, he followed. She held the lamp high so the light fell across the entire space walls, floor, ceiling, the rows of crocks, the jars in their line, the cedar box, the burlap sacks resting against the east wall. Marsh stood at the bottom of the steps. He did not move further into the space. He stood still the way a man stands when he has entered a room that changes the way he understands every room he has been in before, not a revelatory stillness, not a dramatic pause, but the practical stillness of a mind recalculating. Your father showed you this, not a question. A statement delivered with the particular certainty of a man who recognizes inherited knowledge when he sees it, the way a carpenter recognizes another carpenter's joinery, the way a farrier recognizes the hand of the smith who shaped a shoe. Knowledge has a signature. Technique has a provenance. He showed me the idea. Astrid's voice was steady. She was looking at the wall rather than at Marsh, her eyes tracing the line where stone met earth, where the fitted edges of creek-washed fieldstone pressed against the clay subsoil of Wyoming territory 9 feet below a woodshed floor. I had to figure out the rest. Calvin Hale had given her the principle. A palm against a limestone wall. A sentence about the earth remembering summer. The rest, the engineering, the adaptation, the translation of a West Virginia hillside technique into a Wyoming territory survival system was hers. The hours of digging, the trips to the creek for stone, the decision to build beneath the shed rather than into the hillside, the decision to heat the floor stones before laying them, the decision to use hay rather than sawdust, canvas rather than tar paper, earth rather than lumber for the final covering. Each decision a departure from what her father had shown her, a modification driven by different soil, different climate, different materials, different need. The principle was his, the practice was hers. Marsh asked his questions, slowly with pauses between each one that Astrid recognized as the intervals of a man who is not merely gathering information but building something with it, constructing a version of this cellar in his mind that he will later construct with his hands. She answered each one completely without abbreviation. Stone stores heat. Wood resists it. You want both, but you want them in different places. Stone on the walls, where you need the mass to hold temperature through the weeks when the surface is at its worst. Wood on the ceiling, where you need the resistance to slow the transfer from above. Between them, dead air trapped in the hay, sealed by the canvas. Dead air is the best insulator any farmer has access to. It costs nothing, it weighs nothing, it does nothing except refuse to move, which is the one thing you need it to do. Marsh listened. He did not write anything down. He was not a man who wrote things down, he was a man who listened, remembered, reconstructed. The knowledge would travel from Astrid's voice to Marsh's hands without passing through paper, the same way it had traveled from Calvin Hale's hands to Astrid's memory without passing through any medium except proximity, observation, the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from watching someone do a thing correctly enough times that the doing becomes part of your body's vocabulary. They stood in the cellar for most of an hour. They climbed out, the light had shifted, the February sun moved lower, casting longer shadows. Marsh replaced his hat, Astrid replaced the hatch. They stacked the birch back into its rows together, working in silence, the rhythm of the work communicating more than conversation, could have the shared understanding of two people who know what firewood weighs, how it stacks, where the weight needs to sit for the rows to hold. He came back 3 weeks later, the last week of February. This time with his surviving son Harlan, 22, a quieter version of his father, carrying the particular silence of a young man who has recently buried his brother, not yet certain what shape his grief will take when it finishes settling. They brought a wagon with a list of questions that took most of an afternoon to work through. Astrid answered each one with the same completeness she had shown Marsh on his first visit, not because she owed them anything, not because their loss obligated her generosity, but because knowledge that is hoarded does not improve with keeping. It is not wine. It does not age into something finer. It is seed. It either gets planted or it dies in the drawer. The Pruitt family came in March. The young couple from Ohio, he was 28. She was 25. Their first child born the previous November in a house that was colder than any house either of them had occupied in their lives. They had come close enough to catastrophe to recognize the distance between where they had been, where they could have been, as a distance measured in preparation rather than luck. Astrid drew them a diagram on the back of a feed store calendar, not a blueprint, a sketch, lines indicating depth, arrows indicating material layers, notes in a handwriting that was functional rather than decorative, the penmanship of a woman who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse in Tucker County, West Virginia, where the curriculum prioritized legibility over beauty because beauty was a luxury the mountains did not require. The Dawes brothers came in April. The two unmarried men from the property to the south, practical, incurious under normal circumstances. The big die-up had recalibrated their standards of curiosity. They had lost 2 yearling calves to the cold. The experience of watching those animals die slowly, visibly, in a barn they could not warm had introduced into their thinking a variable they had not previously considered, the possibility that preparation was not merely advisable but essential, not merely practical but moral, because the animals in their care could not prepare for themselves. Astrid gave them the same diagram she had given the Pruitts. With modifications for their site, the Dawes property sat higher than hers, on a bench above the creek, where the soil was thinner over bedrock. She suggested 7 feet with additional stone on the floor to compensate for the reduced depth, more thermal mass at ground level to offset the shorter column of insulating earth. Marsh built his version that spring. He chose the south end of his equipment, shed a larger structure than Astrid's woodshed, which allowed a wider footprint, 12 feet by 16, at a depth of 8 feet. Harlan did most of the digging. Marsh did the stone work. Astrid visited once, when the walls were up, the floor laid, the roof not yet started. She walked the perimeter, ran her hand along the stone, pressed her palm against the earth wall behind the stone, the way her father had pressed his against the limestone in Dolly's Hollow, feeling the temperature with the flat of the hand, reading the thermal signature of earth that had been exposed by excavation 2 weeks earlier, already beginning to stabilize, already beginning to do what earth does when left alone at depth. It will hold. She was speaking to Marsh, but looking at the wall, at the junction of stone earth, at the line where human construction met geological fact. It will hold because the principle is sound, because the materials are honest, because the earth does what it does, regardless of what happens above it. Marsh's cellar held through the following winter without incident. Astrid's cellar remained in continuous use. Each September she loaded it, the same ritual, the same sequence, the same descent by lamp into the cool, dry space that had become, over the years since its construction, the most reliable element of her operation. More reliable than the house, which required constant maintenance. More reliable than the barn, which leaked heat in winter, leaked rain in spring. More reliable than the weather, the economy, the road to Gillette, the mail rider's schedule, the price of beef at the Buffalo stockyards. She improved the cellar twice. The first modification came in the autumn of 1888, after the second winter of use. During the coldest nights of January 1888, ordinary cold, Not big-up cold, but sustained enough to reveal the system's remaining weaknesses. Astrid had noticed a temperature differential within the cellar itself. The northeast corner, where the stone wall met the earth wall at the deepest point of the excavation, held steady at 39. The southeast corner, farthest from the densest stone mass, dipped to 36 during the same period. 3 degrees. Insignificant in isolation. Significant as an indicator of insufficient thermal mass at the eastern end. She extended the stone floor by 2 feet on the east end. Hauled additional creek stone 40 pounds one trip. Laid the new stones using the same technique as the originals, fire heated. Carried in burlap, set while still warm. The following winter, the southeast corner held at 38. The differential reduced from 3 degrees to 1. The margin widened. The system improved. The second modification came in the autumn of 1891, prompted by a problem she had anticipated but not experienced until the summer of that year. The summer of 1891 was wet, sustained rain through June into July that saturated the ground surface. When Astrid opened the cellar in September, she found the canvas ceiling damp at the seams where capillary action had drawn moisture from the saturated earth above through the canvas joints into the hay layer below. The hay was compressed in patches. The grass stems softened, collapsed under the weight of the earth above, losing the air pockets that constituted its insulating value. She replaced the hay with dry moss harvested from the north woods, the dense, spongy moss that grew on fallen logs in the ponderosa forest above the property. The moss was different from hay in ways that mattered. Denser, more resistant to compression. Less absorbent. The cellular structure of moss repels liquid water while still trapping air in its interstices, providing insulation without the vulnerability to moisture-driven collapse that hay exhibited. She also added a ventilation pipe, a short section of salvage stovepipe, 12 inches of 6-inch diameter iron pipe, fitted with a damper she fabricated from a tin plate, a bolt, a wing nut. The damper allowed controlled air exchange, opened a quarter turn during the loading season when she needed to vent moisture. Closed tight during winter months when every degree of warmth was currency she could not afford to spend on ventilation. After both modifications, what sat beneath the woodshed was a system refined by use. 3 winters of observation had identified 2 weaknesses. 2 modifications had addressed them. Not perfect, no human construction is perfect. But closer to the thing her father had built in Dolly's Hollow, which had itself been closer to the thing his father had built before him, which was in turn a practical adaptation of knowledge that had been common in certain parts of the Appalachian hill country for generations before anyone thought to write it down. No patent, no diagram published in a farming journal, no newspaper article with illustrations, no government bulletin from the Territorial Agricultural Office. Just knowledge passed from hands to hands, from a cellar in Tucker County to a woodshed in Johnson County, through a woman who had carried it in the back of her mind for 27 years before the season arrived that required her to use it. The valley recovered the way all agricultural communities recover from catastrophe, slowly, incompletely, with losses that were permanent woven into gains that were provisional. By the late 1890s, at least 4 cellars in the Clear Creek drainage were built on the principle Astrid had demonstrated: deep, stone-lined, insulated with organic material under a moisture barrier, located beneath existing structures for additional thermal protection. None were identical to hers. Each reflected the particular conditions of the site. One used sawdust instead of moss, another used tar paper instead of canvas. A third was shallower than recommended but compensated with a thicker stone floor, following the modification Astrid had suggested to the Dawes brothers before they failed to act on it. The variations did not trouble Astrid. Variation is how knowledge survives, by adapting to local conditions, by being flexible enough to accommodate differences in soil, in climate, in the skill of the builder. A principle that cannot be varied is a principle that cannot travel. Astrid sold the property in 1897, not because she had failed the opposite. The homestead was producing reliably. The cellar was in its 11th year of uninterrupted service. Flint was old 13, slowing in the mornings. Her milk production diminished but not ceased. Cobb had been replaced in 1894 by a younger horse, a gray mare Astrid named Birch for the color of her coat, purchased from a ranch near Buffalo for a price that represented 3 months of butter sales. The reason for selling was not failure but family. A nephew, Calvin Hale's brother's son, a young man named Thomas Hale, had come to Wyoming from West Virginia in 1895, settling in Cheyenne to work for the railroad. He was the only blood relative Astrid had west of the Appalachians. Astrid was 46. She had been alone on the homestead for 12 years. She had proved what she needed to prove to herself, to the valley, to the memory of a father who had given her one sentence, one gesture, one principle that she had carried into a place he never saw, used it to survive a winter he never imagined. She sold the 100 acres to James Plunkett, Willa Plunkett, a young couple from Missouri, optimistic in the manner of young couples who move to places they have never been, unprepared in the manner of people who believe that optimism is a substitute for information. They arrived in the spring of 1897 with a wagon, 2 children under 5, a set of expectations calibrated to the farming country of central Missouri, which bore approximately the same relationship to the ranching country of northern Wyoming as a pond bears to an ocean, similar in composition, different in every dimension that matters. Astrid showed them the house, the barn, the woodshed, the hay, the creek. She did not show them the cellar. Not because she intended to conceal it, she would have shown them if they had asked. But the conversation did not move in that direction. The Plunketts were interested in acreage, in water rights, in the distance to Gillette, in the condition of the road. The cellar did not come up because it was invisible. It was doing its job sitting beneath a woodshed floor, behind rows of split pine, looking like nothing, containing everything. Astrid moved to Cheyenne in June of 1897. She took the journal, the leather-bound book Emmett had bought her during their first year, filled now with 12 years of entries, temperatures, dates, the 2 numbers separated by a slash that she had written at 3:30 in the morning on January 20th, 1887, the pencil thin in the cold, the hand unsteady, the meaning absolute. She took the thermometer from the cellar wall, leaving the nail. She took nothing else from the cellar. The stores were the Plunketts now. The stones were the earth's. The principle belonged to anyone who stood in the space long enough to understand what it was. The Plunketts discovered the cellar during their second winter on the property. Willa was reorganizing the Firewood in December of 1898, moving pieces from the east side of the shed to the west to improve access during heavy snowfall. When she pulled the birch from the 3rd row on the right, felt the floor shift under her boot, looked down, saw the edge of the hatch, she called James. They moved the remaining wood, found the leather strap, pulled it. The hatch opened onto 8 steps cut into the earth, leading down into a space neither of them had known existed, stone-walled, stone-floored, moss-insulated, canvas-sealed, ventilated by a 6-inch stovepipe with a tin damper, holding an air temperature 20 degrees warmer than the surface on a morning when the surface was 10 below zero. They stood in the cellar the way Gideon Marsh had stood in it 11 years earlier, still, recalculating, reassessing every assumption they had made about the property they had purchased, the woman who had sold it to them, the winter they were in the process of enduring with the inadequate preparations of people who had not yet learned what this place required. They wrote to Astrid. The letter took 8 days to reach Cheyenne. What is the cellar beneath the woodshed? What is it for? How should we use it? Astrid wrote back. 3 paragraphs. The first described the construction depth, materials, purpose. The second described the maintenance, when to open the damper, when to close it, how to check the moss for moisture infiltration, how to read the thermometer on the wall, not as a single number but as a trend, over days, weeks, the slow drift that reveals whether the system is stable or sliding. The third paragraph was shorter than the other 2. It did not contain instructions. It contained the only thing Astrid had that was worth more than instructions. The earth remembers summer longer than we do. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that, winter stops being the enemy. You are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing what the ground already has. Calvin Hale's words, delivered to his daughter in a cellar in Tucker County, West Virginia, in October of 1859. Carried in her memory through 38 years, through a marriage, a migration, a death, a winter that killed livestock across 3 counties, a cellar built with her own hands in a territory that became a state 3 years after she dug it. Now passed to strangers in a letter, the same words, the same principle, the same quiet assertion that the earth is an ally if you understand how to ask it for help, transmitted through handwriting on paper, through the Postal Service of the United States of America, from a woman sitting at a desk in Cheyenne to a couple standing in a kitchen on Clear Creek, reading by lamplight the explanation of a gift they had not known they had received. The Plunketts used the cellar every winter for 30 years. They loaded it each September. They pulled from it each January. They taught their children how it worked, not by lecture, not by diagram, but by inclusion, by bringing the children down the 8 steps each autumn with armloads of potatoes, each winter with empty sacks, the repetition of the labor transferring the knowledge the way repetition always transfers knowledge, through the body rather than the mind, through muscle memory, seasonal rhythm, the habitual association of certain actions with certain times of year that becomes, after enough years, indistinguishable from instinct. Vera Plunkett, born 1901, the youngest daughter, grew up with the cellar the way children grow up with the constants of their landscape: the creek, the ridge, the pine forest on the north slope, the woodshed at the northeast corner of the property with its ordinary floor, its ordinary rows of split firewood, the hatch beneath the third row from the right that opened onto the space where winter could not reach. She married in 1921, moved to Sheridan, Wyoming, 60 miles north, a town large enough to have a main street, a hotel, a newspaper that came out weekly rather than when the editor accumulated enough news to justify the ink. Her husband farmed outside of town on leased ground, raising wheat, cattle in the proportions that the market dictated. They had their own cellar, a conventional one, dug into the hillside behind the house, adequate for ordinary winters, inadequate for extraordinary ones, the same fundamental compromise that Astrid had identified on her own property 35 years earlier. Vera described the Plunkett cellar once to a neighbor in Sheridan who had asked about winter storage after losing half her root stores to a February freeze. The neighbor was a younger woman, recently arrived from Montana, learning the vocabulary of survival in a climate she had not yet fully understood. Vera described it the way she described everything, practically without embellishment, in the language of a woman who had grown up in a place where language was a tool for transmitting information rather than a medium for self-expression. She described the depth, the stone, the moss, the canvas, the ventilation pipe with its tin damper, the temperature that held at 39 degrees when the surface was 50 below. The stores that came through every winter, without loss, without freezing, without the cracked jars, the blackened potatoes, the spoiled lard that plagued every shallow cellar in the county. Then she stopped describing the construction. She looked at the neighbor, the younger woman from Montana, trying to understand a system that had been designed by a woman she had never met, in a decade she had not been alive for, using knowledge that had been acquired in a state she had never visited. It was the most reliable thing on the property. More reliable than the furnace, more reliable than the road, more reliable than the weather forecast. It never let us down, not once. An afternoon in Sheridan, Wyoming. The year is 1930. A girl of 8 follows her father down a set of stone steps beneath a woodshed floor. The air changes as she descends, the sharp bite of the surface giving way to something cooler but kinder, something that does not attack the skin but simply rests against it. Neutral, patient, carrying the faint mineral smell of earth that has not been disturbed. The cellar is smaller than the one in Johnson County. Different stone, the sandstone here is redder, coarser, laid with less precision than the original, the joints packed with gravel rather than sand. The floor is packed earth without the fire-heated stone layer that Astrid had used, a simplification that costs 2 degrees of performance but saves a day of labor, a trade-off the builder accepted without knowing the full history of the decision he was simplifying. The ventilation pipe is newer galvanized steel instead of salvaged stovepipe, fitted with a manufactured damper rather than a hand-cut tin plate. The canvas has been replaced with tar paper. The moss has been replaced with sawdust. The variations do not matter. The principle is intact. The father, Vera's husband, a wheat farmer who learned the technique from his wife, who learned it from her parents, who learned it from a letter written by a woman who learned it from her father in a different state, a different century, a different world, places his palm flat against the stone wall. Fingers spread, eyes closed for a moment, he opens his eyes, looks at his daughter. She is watching his hand on the stone the way children watch things that adults do, with deliberateness, not understanding the purpose, but recognizing the weight, the significance, the way certain gestures carry a meaning that exceeds their physical content. Feel that? The stone is still warm from summer. It will remember until February. The girl reaches out, places her palm against the wall beside her father's. The stone is cool against her skin, but not cold. Not the aggressive cold of the surface. Something different. Something patient. Something that is giving rather than taking, releasing rather than seizing, offering rather than demanding. She does not know where the words came from. She does not know that they traveled 1,500 miles to reach this wall, passing through 4 families across 7 decades, surviving the death of the man who first spoke them, the migration of the woman who first heard them, the catastrophic winter that first tested them, the years of use that first proved them. She does not know that the principle beneath her palm is older than anyone alive, that it was old before it had a name, that it belongs to no one because it belongs to the earth, which does not issue patents, does not publish papers, does not care who receives credit for the observation that it holds warmth the way memory holds experience, slowly, faithfully, giving back what was given to it long after the surface world has moved on. She does not need to know any of this. The knowledge does not require its own history to function. It requires only a hand on a wall, a voice in the quiet, a child standing beside a parent underground, feeling the warmth rise to meet a palm that is too small to understand what it is touching, but large enough to remember.